So first of all, I would like to thank you so much for the film. And my first question is did you manage to screen the film in Russia publicly?
Thank you, Mal. Is the microphone working?
Everything is fine. So.
Thank you, and thanks again for hosting us here tonight. Yes, we showed this film in more than 30 cities in Russia. The Russian premiere of it was held on the 30th of November of last year in Nizhny Novgorod. I wanted to have the first Russian screening, not in Moscow, not in St. Petersburg, but in Nizhny Novgorod, because that is, of course, a region, a place where Boris spent, I think, the best years of his life. So I wanted to do it there. And the date was, had a meeting to the 30th of November of 1991. He became governor of the Nizhny Novgorod region, so it was the 25th anniversary of that date that we held the Russian screening. And then, since then, in these 10 months since, we have shown the city in this film in more than 30 cities across Russia, from west to east, from the Baltic and Kaliningrad to the far east and Khabarovsk. I myself personally showed it in 11 cities before the poisoning that happened in February, and then since then, my colleagues have continued to show it and to screen it. And actually, one of the screenings was held, it was in January. We showed it in Yekaterinburg at the Yeltsin Presidential Center. And that was actually, that was a very new experience for me, because the Yeltsin Presidential Center is actually a government institution. It's financed by the federal budget. Its chairman, the chairman of the board, is Anton Vaino, who is Vladimir Putin's chief of staff. He's also, I believe, the grandson of your first secretary.
We know him well.
And it's an institution that's entirely dependent on the state. And as you can imagine, this is not a film that would be favorably received by state authorities in Russia today. But that's really that's an exception, I think, that place. And it's like an oasis, an island of free thought. And we had a big screening in January in Yekaterinburg, in a big room just like this, even a little bigger. A lot of people, discussion, questions and answers. And then after this, I called Tatiana Dyachenko, who is Boris Yeltsin's, President Yeltsin's daughter, and she's the kind of the main, she's not called a director, but she's the main person in the Yeltsin Center. I said, I don't know how you do this, but thank you very much. And then the Nizhny Novgorod screening was also different from others in that I actually had members of the current regional government show up at the screening, and members of the current Legislative Assembly show up at the screening, which is, again, something that has not and cannot happen anywhere else. But Nizhny Novgorod really is the only place in Russia today where Boris Nemtsov is remembered not by the caricature propaganda image that Putin's TV channels have created for him, but actually for who he was and for what he has done. People know him for who he really is. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning when we opened this meeting, that the whole goal for me in making this film was to show him how he really was. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to show it all across Russia. And of course, now we are doing these screenings outside of Russia. And on the 9th of October, which will be Boris Nemtsov's birthday, so in about a month from now, when he would have been 58, we're going to publish this film openly online for everybody to see on YouTube. And then we're going to make a special website with the film, but also not just with the film, but also with all of the stuff that didn't, because, I mean, I could make a film about Boris Nemtsov that would last 6 hours, but I wanted to have a reasonable time. I think an hour, this is little more than an hour. This is a good time for a film. And so, of course, so many things we could not possibly physically fit into it. And there were so many interesting stories, probably more than in the film, that remained outside. And it was, for me as a historian by education, I felt so sorry not putting it in, but we had the physical limit. So on this website of the film, we're going to have those additional materials also put out online, published, so that stories, the episodes that didn't, from people's interviews that didn't make it into the film itself, you'll be able to go on the website and see them. We're going to do this gradually. So on the 9th of October, it's just going to be the film itself, and then we're going to be adding all of those other materials.
Okay, great. So if you feel that you would like to have a question, just give a sign. So it's interesting that you didn't have any obstacles in screening the film in Russia, because in August we presented the film of Oleg Sentsov, and we heard from the producer and the filmmaker Askol Kurov that it's impossible to no festivals in Russia accept the film, that they are just afraid, they just refuse it.
Well, I cannot say that we didn't have any obstacles, but I have to say that compared to what we usually encounter, I mean, every time we, for example, at the Open Russia movement have events in the Russian regions, which we do a lot of. I mean, in the last 3 years, I've been all over the country. We've been doing these public events and meetings and discussions and roundtables, and almost every single time, the authorities are trying to sabotage it and make sure it doesn't go ahead. They, of course, put pressure on the owners of the buildings not to let us in. Then they, if somebody does let us in, then they switch off electricity in the building or in a whole block. They call in with a fake bomb threat. The police arrive, starts evacuating everybody. So they really do try to sabotage and prevent our events from going ahead. By the way, we've never cancelled once. We find another place if we must. We did events in the streets, in cafes, in parks. Mm-hmm. We once had a political debate in a swimming pool in Novosibirsk because that was the only place available. So we still go ahead, but they do try to sabotage every time. With this film, with the film screenings, I must say it was not at that level. We had a couple of regions also where there were calls from the local government saying, don't do this. Again, we found alternative places. And then there were other things like when we were filming in Nizhny Novgorod, actually exactly a year ago, we were attacked. The cameraman and myself, it was in between the screenings, so we just thought we have a bite to eat in a cafe. So we went and sat down in a cafe. As soon as we ordered the food, 5 masked men stormed in the cafe and started throwing eggs. And it wasn't so much painful as it was, I mean, it's caught by surprise. You're trying to eat and then something flows in your eyes. And then we lost a lot of time because we have to go and change. We didn't look very presentable after that, which of course indicated that they knew exactly where we were and at what time, but that's obviously not surprising for you know what the situation in Russia is. But with the film screenings, yes, I have to say that we didn't encounter as much sabotage and resistance as we usually do. But you know, even for them, for the people who are the current authorities in Russia, I think even by their standards, it will be a little too low to try to sabotage film screening in memory of someone who is no longer alive. I mean, I would not be surprised. They're always, you know, когда мы думали, что уже дно снизу постучали, as you know, it's every time when we thought we reached the bottom, somebody knocked from there. So they could have done it, I guess, but they haven't. And so we managed to show it almost, you know, in quite a few places in Russia.
Okay, very good. So I think that people can ask questions in English, Absolutely. In Russian, in Estonian.
I'm afraid I'll be asking for your help if it's in Estonian.
Just name the language. So that was Katya, please.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Vladimir, for the excellent movie. Very warm and very informative, and it was a pleasure to see it on screen. My question is that in this movie, some people who were interviewed, of course, they said that there is no one as Boris Nemtsov. He was an exceptional person, and what he was striving for, his work is still not done. I mean, and now we all know that it's much harder to achieve what he wanted to achieve, as it was at the end of the 90s, and we know that there are people in the opposition like yourself who are risking their lives to strive what he was striving for. So, could you tell what can be done? I know it's not an easy question, but what are the assumptions? How we can reach where he wanted to get?
Thank you for the question, Katya. Thank you for being here. And what you said at the beginning is absolutely correct. I mean, you know, we have a saying in Russian, which you well know: "Незаменимых людей не бывает." There are no irreplaceable people. It goes. Well, I can tell you that saying is not true. There are, and he was. And when people ask me, "Oh, who do you think can replace him now?" I say, no one. He was unique in so many ways, and I know I'm not objective about this because he was a close friend as well as a political colleague. But, you know, I've seen this man in so many different situations. I've worked alongside him for more than 15 years. And I've never seen, and had a lot of interactions with politicians in Western countries too, and I must say, either in the West or in Russia, I've never seen a politician who could walk into a room as big as this, full of people, into an audience that would be hostile to him. You could feel the tension in the air, And then he will speak to them and argue and ask questions and respond and argue again for an hour, for 2 hours, for 3 hours. And at the end of that conversation, 2/3 of the room will be on his side. I've never seen anybody do this. I've seen him do that. He was also, I mean, you have to be a good communicator to be in politics. I think that goes without saying. But again, I've spent a long time in Russian politics. I have not seen anybody who could speak, for example, with the same level of effectiveness to a local market saleswoman in Yaroslavl and to a United States senator. He could. And so I was recently interviewed by an American journalist, and he asked me, he said, I have to apologize because this question is going to sound really awkward, but do you think they made a mistake in killing him? He asked me. And I said, well, you know what? My answer is going to sound even more awkward. No, they did not. They killed the strongest one. There is no question about it. But of course, life goes on, and we have to continue the best we can without him, and we're trying to. And yes, he has not lived to see the day when Russia will be a free country, but it will be. And when it is, it's going to be, in a large extent, thanks to him. And what we're doing now is actually, in many ways, the things he would say that are most important always, especially in recent years. He would say education is very important. It's a long-term thing, obviously, but we need to do it. And for example, a lot of what we now do in Open Russia is about education. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of those different events all around the country. We also partner with the different international organizations to do some international training sessions and events too. For example, we have this program where when there are elections in Western countries, we would take a group of regional activists from Russia to that country to show them what it's actually like, what a real democratic process actually looks like, because we haven't had one for 2 decades. And also around that time, we would organize like a full week of training with sessions, seminars, lectures, and we've done this. The first time we did this was last November. We took a group of regional activists to the United States for their presidential election. Last May, in May of this year, we took another group of people to France for the French elections. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to take a group to Berlin for the German elections, and next month we're going to bring a group here to Tallinn for your municipal elections, which I see so many posters around the city for. So we're doing all of these things. Actually, a lot of the work we do now is educational. Even though Open Russia is a political movement, a lot of what we do sounds like an educational activity, and it is, because we feel it's important. And even when we're talking about elections in Russia, what they have become, you know, but we still use them as an education opportunity. So for instance, a year ago when there was the parliamentary election, or the so-called parliamentary election, we had candidates all across the country, young people, young activists whom were put up as candidates in this election, not so they can win, because that is not possible today for obvious reasons, but so that they can learn. Because even in a fake election process like we have now, you can still, if you're a candidate, you can still learn how to talk to people, how to walk door to door, how to speak at rallies, how to publish leaflets in newspapers, how to organize on local issues, all of these things. And so we are doing this. And I often use the analogy, there was a famed Soviet pianist in the 20th century, Rudolf Kara. He was ethnic German, so when the war began, he was exiled with his family to Kazakhstan. And he spent 13 years in internal exile in the steppes of Kazakhstan in some wooden barracks. And needless to say, he didn't have a piano with him in there. So what he did is he took out a plank of wood and a knife, and he carved out a fake keyboard on a plank of wood, and he would practice, just so his fingers wouldn't forget. And he did this for 13 years, and then under Khrushchev, he was allowed to return back to Moscow. He went on to becoming a soloist at the Moscow Philharmonic. He taught at our conservatoire. He was one of the most accomplished pianists of his time. He won the USSR-wide musical soloist competition in the 1960s. And that is a guy who for 13 years practiced on a plank of wood. So what we're doing today is that plank of wood. We want to help that young generation be prepared as much as possible for that time when things do change, and for that time when that generation, the young generation, will have the responsibility to build something new in Russia once the Putin regime is gone. So I know it's a long-term thing, but we feel it's important. And we're trying to do this as much as we can, and we will continue to do this. Whatever the obstacles they come up with and put in our way, we're not going to give up. Because that would just be too big of a gift for them. They want us to give up and run, I think, more than anything, and we're not going to do that. And Boris always said, it's our country, we have to fight for it. That's a very important motivation.
And we did see these very brave young people in March. end of March when they
Yes, and then again in June for the
went
second
to,
time.
yeah, rallies,
Absolutely.
and then there were thousands of them. So who weren't afraid.
That was amazing, by the way. It was the end of March was the first wave, and then the second wave was in June. And of course, in March, when the first protests happened, the regime responded in the usual way. So they sent riot police and National Guard to beat people up and disperse peaceful rallies and arrest people for nothing. And so in June, when the second wave of protests began, of course, people knew that this was exactly what was going to happen, but even more people came, and in even more cities and towns across Russia. Almost 200 towns and cities across Russia participated in the protest on the 12th of June. East to west, Vladivostok to Kaliningrad, 11 time zones. In terms of, if we're talking about the geographic diversity, these are the biggest protests we have seen since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Usually, you know this, all the political activities, Moscow and St. Petersburg and Moscow. This was national. And it was very heartening to see, as you just said, exactly right, that the vast majority of those people who came out to protest, and the protests were against the endemic government corruption and the political conditions that allow for this endemic government corruption, which is the current regime of Vladimir Putin. And the vast majority of those people who came out to protest against him were young people. The people who are in their early 20s and late teens, a lot of university students, a lot of high school students. In fact, the people who all they knew for their entire lives is Vladimir Putin. Because don't forget, he's been in power for 18 years now. Same as Brezhnev. And he wants to go on for more. But so far, 18 years. So there's now a whole generation that doesn't have any other memory. That all they have seen their whole lives on their television screens is his face. And I have to remind myself sometimes when I go around Russia and meet with these young activists, I have to remind myself that I'm speaking to someone who does not remember and does not know anything except Vladimir Putin. And yet it is representatives of that generation that are now increasingly saying enough. Enough of this corruption, enough of the impunity, enough of the lack of accountability, enough of the arrogance. And frankly, I think talking to many of these people, we're beginning to see, it's a slow process, it's going to happen overnight, it's going to be gradual, but we are seeing in them that their self-awareness as citizens who are demanding respect from their own state is gradually becoming stronger than the sense of fear of potential repressions. And that, I think, is a very worrying sign for Mr. Putin, but a very hopeful sign for Russia.
Sure. So we have a question over there.
Yes, thank you very much. I think your film is a very powerful testament to what Nemtsov stood for. And I learned a tremendous amount. I liked the way it went back to the beginning and gave you a sense of the unfolding of the political system and situation in Russia. Excuse me. I was struck near the end of the film, there's an interview, and I believe it's the voice of Nemtsov himself, though I'm not sure because it's not identified on the screen.
At the very end?
Yes,
of course, that is him.
That's him, yeah. And I was struck by an image he uses where he describes power as like cast iron, if you know how to hit it right. Mm-hmm. It may appear to be very solid and impenetrable and durable, but if you know how to hit it right, it will crumble into pieces. Which I think in the film was, because I was waiting for him to talk about, I've listened to him speak in debates and so on YouTube, and he was always very eloquent and extremely insightful in terms of his analysis. I'm wondering, since you knew him so well, what was his analysis of the weaknesses of the system? So far you've talked about an awakening of civic consciousness, which may over the long term lead to change. But I'm wondering, the system now seems so much like that cast iron. Where are the weaknesses? What are its internal contradictions that may prove its undoing over the long haul, or maybe even the short term? I mean, do you have an analysis of that, or did he have an analysis of that?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for your kind words also. I think there are only two things that this regime is afraid of most. And one is about what is going on inside Russia, and one is on the international level. The first thing they're afraid of, that they're mortified of, is the site of mass protests on the streets of Russia. I'll never forget those 3 weeks in December of 2011, which you saw there, which suddenly, for years would be lucky to get 600 people at an opposition rally. And then 100,000 came up. And these guys were mortified in the Kremlin. Just the faces of the police, of the riot police on Sakharov Avenue on the 24th of December 2011, you could see fear in their faces. You don't usually see that. And of course, if you remember, the regime began, over the first 72 hours, they issued concession after concession after concession. I mean, in 2010, Medvedev, who was then the formal president, came out and he was asked at a press conference, so when do you think direct elections for regional governors will be restored in Russia? He said, not in 100 years. A year later, it took 100,000 people standing in front of the Kremlin. They returned it in 24 hours. They also released some political prisoners. They registered a couple of opposition parties. They didn't know what to do. They were panicking. So they are mortified of this. And this is why they're reacting so harshly now to this new wave of protests that we're beginning. But again, I think just the trends, I mean, the demographics don't lie. Putin's 65. The bulk of those protesters are between 17 and 25. That's not a good correlation for him. So that's the first thing he's mortified of, the sight of the people on the streets of Russia. That's, by the way, in my view, and Boris believed this too, by the way, the main motivation for Putin's aggression against Ukraine in 2014 was not geopolitical, was not spheres of influence, was not foreign policy. It was because he was afraid of the precedent. Because Ukraine and Russia are so similar in so many ways. I mean, when good things happen here or in other Baltic states or in other Central European states, that's not a direct example for us because we're too different. Ukraine, I mean, we have basically the same language, we have a shared history, same religion. I mean, if there is a successful democratic European experiment in Ukraine, that would be a direct example for us. And Putin realized this, of course. He really did enjoy the pictures of Mr. Yanukovych boarding his helicopter in Kharkov and running away at the sight of the hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating on the streets of Kiev. That was an analogy too close to home for him. And this is why he crushed it with all his might. He tried to prevent their success before it would become a model and an inspiration for our people. So this is the first thing, street protest. And the second thing is an international factor. They are also mortified of the personal targeted sanctions imposed by Western countries, not against Russia as a country. That he doesn't really care about. Moreover, he actually uses it for his propaganda purposes, to say the West is anti-Russian and I'm the defender of Russian national interests. But personal sanctions, that's completely different. A few years ago, this was briefly mentioned in the film as well, Boris began to work to try to convince members of parliaments in Western countries, both in Europe and in America, to introduce what really should be a very simple principle, that those people who engage in human rights abuse, in corruption, who torture, who murder, who rig elections, so the people who trample on all the most basic norms of the civilized world, that these people should not be allowed to personally enjoy the freedoms and privileges that the civilized world has to offer, because they do that. And they have been doing this for years. I mean, these people, they like to steal in Russia but spend in the West, and this is what they have been doing. And too many Western countries have been abetting them and enabling them to do that. Because as you know, I mean, we can talk a lot about the similarities between what happened in Soviet times and what we have in Russia today, and there are many similarities. We have political prisoners, we have media censorship, we have no free and fair elections, and so on. But for all these many similarities, there's one very important difference, and that is that members of the Soviet Politburo didn't have bank accounts in the West. They didn't send their kids to study in the West. They didn't buy up houses and vineyards and yachts and all the rest of it in Western countries. These guys do. And we think this is a double standard, and this is a hypocrisy, and we think that this should stop. And so 5 years ago, the US Congress passed this law. It's called the Magnitsky Act. And I remember it was passed on the 16th of November 2012. It was the third anniversary of the death of Sergei Magnitsky. And Boris and I were sitting on the House Visitors Gallery in the US Capitol, in the US House of Representatives, looking at them vote for it. And Boris said this is the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign country, because it targets those who abuse our rights and who steal our money through corruption. And since then, there have been several initiatives across the world to introduce similar measures. And I'd like to recognize Christina Oiland, who's a former member of the European Parliament, who led the efforts at the European Parliament to pass a resolution in support of the Magnitsky sanctions. And I'm also very heartened and grateful for the fact that Estonia has become last year the first country, and so far remains the only country in the European Union, to pass its own national law And we really hope that more Western countries follow, again, what should really be a very simple principle. So those two things I would say, mass protests in Russia and international accountability, which they're so afraid of.
You mentioned that Russia has not changed very much comparing to Soviet times.
It has, but then it changed back.
We had just couple of days ago here a legendary writer, Vladimir Vainovich, and he said almost the same, that yes, Russia is very much the same as Soviet Union, but the gates are open.
Yeah.
So from the film, I loved very much in the film where Zhanna was talking, Boris's daughter. And I remember when we invited her 2 years ago here, it was last year, to Estonia then, and she was very surprised that when Boris was here at our Lennart Meri conference, that he praised her, that my daughter is so brave, I take always her with me to the rallies. And Zhanna couldn't believe it, that her father was so proud of her because of her braveness. So the young people are really, really different nowadays, and it seems that there is hope, in spite of the fact that very different signals are coming from Russia, especially if people watch the so-called zombie boxes and television. So it's difficult to know what is the reality, under the ground. But people like you, of course, like Boris, young people give a hope that another Russia is possible.
Absolutely, and I think we always need to distinguish between this artificial picture that's created by Kremlin propaganda and what's actually happening in reality. I want to acknowledge also my godfather who's in the audience, and he, back in the 90s, he started a little earlier than I did, but back in the 90s, he took out his TV set and threw it out. And I was, at the time, I didn't understand why. I was asking him, why did you do this? Now I understand, of course, and now in my apartment in Moscow, I don't have a TV set either, because I value my nervous system too much to watch all of this stuff. Can you see this here, by the way? Do you? Okay. So I don't need to explain to you, except you also have
6 channels.
Right, but you also have other ones. We don't. This is all we have.
Yeah, we have those too. Yes.
Okay. Well, we don't have Dost, as you know, because since 2014 they threw it out of all the cable and satellite providers. But don't judge Russia and what's happening in Russia, and certainly don't judge Russian society by this caricature, fake image that the Putin propaganda is peddling. And I also have to mention the proverbial 86% that people are always talking about. There is this notion that unfortunately too often is also repeated uncritically by Western commentators, that Putin is widely popular in Russia, that he has 86, 87, 90, 95, whatever other figures they give out of support. And I just always say to this, really? I mean, if you have such high support, why do you need to rig elections all the time? Wouldn't you just win them?
Sure.
Why do you need to silence the media? Wouldn't you just win the argument if you're so popular? Why do you need to put your opponents in prison and beat up peaceful, unarmed people at opposition rallies if you're so strong and popular? That's not the behavior of somebody who is strong and popular. That's the behavior of someone who is insecure and weak and afraid. And I think given all these trends that we talked about, that we are seeing begin in the last few months, I think that they have reason to feel insecure and weak and afraid.
Yeah, so there are more questions, please.
Thank you very much. This has been extremely moving and wonderful, and the more you show this film, the more you will educate people. What concerns me is this double standard from the West. And this is the issue that I can work on, because there is not much I can do about what is happening domestically in Russia. And it really troubles me that things happen in Russia that never even get reported in the West. And I keep trying to think how to break through this blockade of disinterest, uninterest, apathy about the only person I see writing about some of these smaller incidents that take place in Russia, and some are not so small, is Paul Goebel. And he wrote, for instance, a great deal about the truckers and their protests, which is a big thing. There was never anything in the Western media about this, and I just don't understand how we can break through, because this would help. This would bolster the sanctions and the reason for sanctions and give people an understanding of it. I know you work in Washington, you have ideas about this, but there is no magic bullet. I think it just takes more people who speak well and can address the issues. And as you say, when Boris Nemtsov met with congressional people, that made all the difference, because he was a credible person and he spoke well. But nevertheless, it does seem that there should be some interest in the West, in regional movements, in protests, and in giving them some sort of a coverage and a basis. Another one was the apartment building problem, where they were trying to just take people's apartments away, and people again sort of rallied with this concept of this is my home. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on this, how people could get more attention from the West other than just posting on Facebook.
Well, thank you for this. You raised a very important point. And I just want once again to thank the Open Estonia Foundation for doing the work they're doing, because they are actually bringing these people from Russian civil society, from the NGO sector, from the political opposition here, and we're doing the same in many of those educational projects that we discussed earlier, when we take these activists, young pro-democracy activists from the regions, and engage in people-to-people contacts with their counterparts and colleagues in Western countries. And I think this is so very important, because too often, and if you look back at the last few years, certainly the time Putin has been in power, if you look at the position of Western countries towards what was happening in Russia, I see that the two extremes that have been going on. The first extreme, which went on for far too long, was when Western leaders were pretending that Putin is one of them, that he's a Democrat, that they can do business with him, and they were just closing their eyes and ignoring everything that was going on in Russia. The closure of television channels, the rigging of elections, the suppression of the freedom of assembly, as if none of that existed. And of course, I was recently, I had a conversation recently in Washington with a policymaker who told me, well, you must understand, because I also, I said this to him, and he said, well, you must understand, a lot of us don't really care about whether or not there's democracy in Russia. We care about Russia not invading or threatening other countries. And I said, well, you know what? Those two things are directly and inextricably linked. Because if you have a government that violates the rights of its own people and breaks its own constitution, what's to stop it from disrespecting international norms or the interests of other countries? So those Western leaders who ignored this behavior, domestic behavior, for far too long, one day they woke up to the first territorial annexation in Europe since the Second World War, which Mr. Putin achieved in Crimea in 2014. But now, in the last 3 years since then, we are seeing what I think is another extreme, and that is when people are blaming Russia and talking about the actions of Russia and the behavior of Russia, when in fact they mean the behavior and the actions of a small unelected clique in the Kremlin that has no democratic mandate from the Russian people, because we've not had a free and fair election in the last 17 years. Please don't equate Russia with the Kremlin regime. Russia is so much bigger and wider and has so many diverse and different voices. And we are grateful to our friends and partners and counterparts, such as the Open Estonia Foundation and other organizations that try to facilitate those people-to-people contacts so that people in the West can hear from the other side of Russia. Not Putin and Lavrov, but all those people in the regions who are daily taking the risks by trying to change things around them. And so I think that would be the best way to break through that kind of block that you talked about, the lack of information, when people engage in contacts and talk to the people and hear their stories. And of course now it's with the modern technology and with all the social media, it should be much easier to do this. So we are trying to do it as much as we can from our side, and we're very grateful to partners on the Western side of this who are helping us and who are doing it from their side.
You, Marianne, touched upon a very, very important point, that yes, West is lacking in information, but also Russians inside Russia lack information. And I think there are some people or representatives of new wave of immigrants, civic activists from Russia who are living, here or near to Russia, who are trying to spread the information what is going on in Russia through social networks. Like there is an excellent portal called Aktivatika.org, which is
it's based here?
yes,
Okay.
and which is mainly discussing environmental issues, but also human rights and civic activism issues. So now, what do you think? Is there? Do the immigrants now, new immigrants abroad, have a new role in the mobilizing and activating and motivating activists inside Russia?
Well, I think, again, just because of the nature of the new information technology and the world we live in, it's now possible to do a lot of the things, even if you're not physically inside. So a lot of the people who are abroad, as you mentioned, they could help to spread information and support the protest movement in other ways. I mean, usually whenever we have big protests in Russia, there are usually also actions that take place in front of Russian embassies or consulates across the world. I mean, that's an important symbolic support, I guess. There's fundraising that could be done, for example, for the NGO sector, for civil society groups, by people, by the Russian diaspora that lives abroad. But most importantly, and I always say this too, when I travel around and speak to representatives of Russian diaspora in Western countries, in America, in Western Europe, I always say to them that when things change, we will need you to come back, because we will need you to help us build that new Russia after Putin. This is what happened, of course, in the Baltic states in 1990 and 91. Many of the people in the diasporas returned. I mean, you only had 40 years of Soviet rule. We had 74. That's a big difference. So when Soviet rule collapsed in Russia, I mean, it was the same year. It was 1991. But for you, it had only been 40 years of this. We had it since 1917. So there was almost nobody alive who remembered what was before. For you, it was very different. And well, let's begin with the facts that two of the Baltic states had presidents who were from the diasporas, and I think, I mean, you're in a much better position to say this than I do, but I always thought that this played an important role when people from the diasporas, from the Baltic diasporas, had experience in living in free democratic states, came back and helped you build your own free and democratic states here, and we will need to do the same thing, because the brain drain under Putin has been astonishing. And I saw some estimates that in the last 5 years alone, so since the crackdown on Bolotnaya, something like 2 million people left, and a lot of them are leaving for political reasons. And they're some of the best people, frankly, some of the most active, professional, educated, the young people, the middle class. And of course, Putin is only very happy to see them leave. I'm asked sometimes, again, going back to this similarity between the Soviet regime and the Putin regime, people ask, so when is he finally going to close the border? And, like the Soviet Union, and re-erect the Iron Curtain? I said never, because he's happy for people to leave. Because who are the kinds of people who are leaving? It's the people who will be protesting against his rule and demanding freedom and democracy and their rights. So he's only happy. He wants us all to go. Go ahead. Whenever I fly into Moscow, I spent about 45 minutes usually on passport control when I come in, because they call someone something, they look something on the screen. I don't know, because I don't see the screen. Somebody comes in and asks them something. When I fly out, 10 seconds, get out of here. They're only happy about this.
Yeah, it's
but
very,
you know
very
what?
telling.
But we're not. You know what? We're not going to leave, because I think that is the best gift we could give them, is to just give up and run away, and we're not going to do that.
Sure. We have a question.
Hi. Thanks for a very interesting film. You covered through the history of Boris Nemtsov. You covered the whole history of modern Russia. So. Yeah, and it's where my question starts. Like in 91, when Soviet Union collapsed, old people in the Soviet Union were like drinking freedom, were enjoying it. And it was here in Estonia. I talked to my parents, they talked about us here, it's like, yeah, we're free, we can do everything what we want, and so on. And it's what's the most important idea of the people. And if you watch the start of career from Boris as a political leader, is starting to gain freedom for people. And where did it connect? Where did it started to go backwards in Russia? Because it didn't happen here, it happened in Russia.
Yeah.
Do you like...
Why? You asking why?
Why and when? And the second question,
Why,
can
why?
you like
Okay.
nick it back? Can you like do you see it? How can you restore the freedom in Russia? Can you do it, as Boris talked about it, with an evolution? Or is it only the revolution way that can be done?
Thank you. Two very important questions. On the first one, I would say actually just as in your question a minute ago about what are the two things Putin is afraid of most, one is domestic, one is international, I would say probably, in my personal view, the two most significant factors for the failure of Russia's democratic transition in the 90s, there was also one domestic and one international. The domestic one, I would say, is our failure. When I say our, I mean the new democratic government in Russia that came to power in 1991. That government's failure to, well, they said A, but they never said the B. So they defeated Soviet rule, the Soviet regime went down, and more than that, in 1992, the Russian Constitutional Court, which is the highest judicial body, it was at that time, now it's the European Court of Human Rights because we're now in the Council of Europe, but back then that was the highest judicial body. It actually ruled officially that the Soviet communist regime was responsible for mass repressions, for the repressions against millions of people. This is an official judicial decision from the highest judicial body in Russia, but nothing happened after that. Here in the Baltic states and in many other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, you had lustrations, you had the opening of the archives, you had the public condemnation of the former regimes as criminal and of their security services as criminal. I mean, can you imagine in Germany somebody from the Stasi's political department reaching a high level of power? It would be impossible. Here, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you served in the, if you remained in the Communist Party leadership after Vilnius, or if you were a KGB officer, you're also limited in what you can do, right, politically?
Yeah.
And I know this is the case in Latvia also, in Lithuania. We never had any of this. We never had lustrations. We never had a public condemnation of the regime. It was only half condemned. And so you had this moral relativity. And, you know, if someone said in August of 1991, when we had hundreds of thousands of people standing on the streets of Moscow and going to the Lubyanka to topple the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the KGB, which, you know, took him by the noose and brought him down, if you said to those people that 8 years from now, 8 years is nothing, 8 years from now, an officer from this building, from the KGB, will be in charge of the country, nobody would have believed this. So I think that was the very important domestic mistake that we made. I mean, I say we, I was in school at that time in 5th grade, but when I say we, I mean we Russians. But I think there was also an international aspect. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to blame what happened in Russia on the outside. That would be too easy. That's not, the main responsibility is with us. But there was an international factor. And I think that factor was that Russia, the democratic Russia of Boris Yeltsin in the 90s, never really had that clear path of European integration and of fully rejoining the European family that other post-communist countries did, like the Baltic states, like Central and Eastern Europe. In December of 1991, at the end of December, President Yeltsin sent a letter to Manfred Wörner, the General Secretary of NATO, officially as President of Russia, raising the question of Russian membership of NATO. He never even got a response. And we never had that clear path that served, I don't need to tell you this, as such a powerful incentive for reforms in your countries. I mean, Havel called the whole post-communist transformation, he called it a return to Europe. But for him, it was a dual-track process. You reform domestically with the goal of rejoining Europe fully. We never had that prospect. And I think that was also a big factor in contributing to the failure. And when we speak of the need to learn from past mistakes, we have a lot to learn from, trust me, in Russia. But I think it's also important that the international community and our friends and neighbors in Europe, next time change happens in Russia, and next time we engage in a democratic transition, which will happen. It's a question of when, not if. When that happens, I think it's very important for our friends and neighbors in Europe to stand ready to welcome that democratic Russia into their ranks, into their family, which did not happen back in the 90s. And the second part of your question, remind me?
Do you believe in the evolution?
Oh, yes, thank you. So, Boris always said, and it's in the film too, that we've had enough revolutions, we've had enough blood, and we've had enough violence, and that's not a good way to change government, needless to say. I'm just stating the obvious. So I think we must do everything we can to make sure that when that change comes, it will be as smooth, as peaceful, and as constitutional as possible. But unfortunately, it's not all up to us. And if, you know, the Kremlin likes to say that we, members of the Russian opposition, are fostering a Maidan or preparing a revolution in Russia. If anybody is preparing a revolution in Russia, it's the people who are in the Kremlin today. Just like Nicholas II was the biggest revolutionary 100 years ago, so it is Vladimir Putin today. Because if you shut down every single legal avenue for expressing alternative opinions, for voicing your protest, when Parliament is not a place for discussion, as its own speaker has said, when elections are not real, the opposition is in most cases just disqualified from the ballot, or if it's on the ballot, the conditions are such that it's impossible to get anything because they write whatever vote tallies they want. When the media is not a place for discussion either because it's all controlled by the regime. When you shut down all those valves, but you know what, things don't stand still and public sentiments change and nothing is forever, and Mr. Putin is not forever either. But if he shut down all of the normal ways of changing the government, well, then something else will happen, as we've seen too many times in our history. We don't want this to happen. I always stress this. We do not want a revolution in Russia, because revolutions in Russia never end really well, as you know. But if anybody is preparing a revolution, it's those guys who are in the Kremlin today.
Question, please, Riina.
Riina Kaljurand, I'm director of the Lennart Meri Conference, which you also participated for 2 years ago. And
Hope to be back.
Exactly.
I'm sorry I couldn't make it this year, but I had good reason, as you know.
I know.
Well, not a very good reason, but a valid reason.
Exactly. I have had the honor and pleasure to meet Boris Nemtsov several times, and it has always been very, very memorable and fun to communicate with him, even if we just negotiated his role at the conference, or the topic he would talk about. So it was a lot of fun. And he loved Tallinn, he loved life. He always ended up at a nightclub and returned very late, and sometimes it was difficult to wake him up for the panel. but it was part of that life. But I have a very simple question. You know, when I organize the conference, I have an ideal or a vision in front of me, and I sort of have a very high ambition, but I never know exactly how the conference will end up, who will turn up, who will accept or decline the invitation, who will agree to talk about one or the other topic, and so I don't know. It sort of always deviates from the script, the original script. And I wanted to ask you, how much did your original script deviate from the outcome?
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the question, and thank you for the work you do. Lennart Meri is a wonderful conference. Boris never missed it. He came every year, and I was very honored to be invited and hope to be back again. And he certainly did love Tallinn, and he took every opportunity to come here. On the script, the thing is I didn't really have an original script. As I said at the beginning, this is a film that should not have been made. I never wanted to make this. But I felt I had to. And so I thought I would just take it as it goes. I didn't have any preconceived ideas, because despite the fact that I spent 15 years working together with him, I actually also learned some new things for me in this film, on both a personal level, on in terms of some of the aspects of his biography. I mean, we were really close. He was actually godfather to my younger daughter, so in Russia that's family. But even for me, there were new things. So I didn't have a preconceived script. I just wanted to interview all those people and see, and also look through the archives, and I went to the libraries to search through old newspapers. And then it was really difficult, by the way, to find newspapers from 1991, because as you remember, that was a period when everything was collapsing, and so they were not sending the obligatory copies of the newspapers to libraries as they were supposed to, but I was able to find them in other places. So when I had all the information, I just really sat down and the script wrote itself. That's all I can say. The only thing I did know from the beginning, I knew two things. That I'm not going to have death in this film at all. I knew that I could not have done it any other way than this. So I knew there's not going to be death. And secondly, I knew that I want to have him finish the film, which he does. So I want the last words to be his. And I wanted them to be optimistic, which was not hard, because he was, as you know, a very optimistic person. And he always believed in the future of Russia, and we try to as well, and I certainly do as well. So that wasn't difficult, but I still had to listen through a lot of his interviews, and it was very difficult as well, as you can imagine, but to find those few right short phrases. And I hope it works there in the end. So the script just wrote itself, honestly. I wish I'd said that I had this really, crafted plan where I would do this and that, but no, I didn't. I just sat down and it wrote itself. I went into my parents-in-law's apartment in Moscow. I locked myself in the kitchen and asked them not to bother me, and I just sat down for 2 days straight, just breaking up to eat, and I wrote it. It was a year ago, last September. So it wrote itself, basically. Thanks for the question. And I think just as with your conference, I think the best things are the ones that do not follow some prearranged scheme and that just happen themselves. That's how Boris was too. He never wrote his speeches in advance, never. He would turn up and speak, and he was wonderful. Sometimes, when he was sitting already on the panel and somebody was speaking, he was supposed to be next, maybe he would jot down like a couple of points, and that would be wow. That would for him be like really advanced preparation, because usually he would just come and speak. And I guess I wrote this in a kind of similar way.
Yeah, so some more 2 questions, and then we will round up slowly but surely.
Good evening, thank you for the movie. I have actually 2 questions. There's this assumption that some people hold about Russia only understands power regarding international relations. So would you say that it's the correct or the right approach that should Western countries hold regarding Putin's Russia in today's international affairs? And the second question is, what do you think is the best thing that could international organizations or Western states do, which would be the best for Russian democratic opposition in today's Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. Both very important questions. The first one, this regime only understands the position of strength, nothing else. If you try to do compromises with them, they take it as weakness. And for them, compromise is not an invitation to reciprocate with a compromise, but to demand even more and to become even more aggressive, as they have shown. Because they're from the KGB, that's how they are, that's their mentality, that's what they learn to do. They learn to take advantage of the opponent's weakness. And if they see the opponent is weak, they will take advantage of them. And let's just not forget that the way Putin began doing all of these things was gradual. I mean, he was doing something and then waiting to see what the reaction would be, both from Russian society, but also from the outside world. And so first, he shut down independent TV stations. There was almost no reaction. In fact, I'll never forget this. I was a journalist at the time. I was working in London. And in June of 2003, when Putin shut down the last nationwide independent television channel in Russia, TVS, and they shut it down because with the previous ones, they at least pretended to have some sort of explanation, like there's a shareholder dispute or whatever. You remember all of this. With this last one, Putin's press minister just signed an order saying, in the interest of Russian TV viewers, I'm switching off this channel. And that was it. And 2 days after that, Mr. Putin was treated to the royal reception at the London Guildhall with Tony Blair and the Queen of England. What kind of a message should she have got from that? And this happened all the time. There was no reaction to the destruction of TV, no reaction to the rigging of elections. There was some reaction to Khodorkovsky's arrest, but still on a grand scale, nothing. And then he began trying things abroad. Georgia first, then Ukraine. Now I guess there is some kind of reaction, better late than never, I suppose, but it has been 18 years. So yeah, they only understand the position of principle and the position of strength. That's the only way to speak to them. And your second part, I think I would just reiterate what we were talking about a minute ago. The Russian opposition is not asking the West for political support. That's the Putin propaganda cliche. That is a lie. We're not asking for money. We're not asking for political support. We're not asking you to effect regime change in Russia. This is all these things they're telling about us. They're all lies. It's only for us to change the situation in our country. It's not for any outside players. It's not for you. It's not for the Americans. It's not for anybody. The only thing we do ask from Western nations is, first of all, we ask for honesty, so that they don't pretend things are something else than they actually are, that they are honest and open about what's happening in Russia. That's very important. That sounds like a small thing, but it's really big. So we ask for honesty, which we have not seen for many years. And secondly, again, we do not ask for your support for us. All we ask is that you do not support Mr. Putin by treating him as a respectable and worthy partner, which for so many years you have. You, I don't mean Estonia, I mean the West in general. And secondly, do not support his regime by allowing his cronies to use your countries to park the wealth they have stolen from the Russian people, which again has been happening for far too long. And very heartening in the last few months, or last few years, I guess, if we begin with the American law, but now with Estonia in December, and hopefully other European Union countries will follow. I was just recently in Lithuania a couple of months ago to meet with their members of parliament from different parties. And I think there's a growing momentum in Lithuania to pass a similar measure. We're hoping that in the next 4 weeks it will happen in Canada. They have cross-party support for the same principle. So this is all. You don't need to support us, just don't support them.
Александр Смирнов, Радио 4.
Привет. С вашими коллегами сегодня общались, с Александром.
Отлично. Если можно, я задам вопрос на русском, коли нам позволено. У вас прекрасный английский, прям не хочется переключаться на русский. Но
по-русски тоже более-менее говорю, так что...
Хорошо. Вот в вашем фильме показаны некоторые детали, которые не были широко известны. Действительно, о том, как пытались подкупить Бориса Немцова разными способами. Я лично действительно не знал об этих интересных деталях, что ему предлагали «Газпром» и так далее. Ну, в общем, действительно интересно было узнать об этом. Но вот, как вы думаете, в последнее время так вот начинает как бы проходить все-таки такая, я не знаю, то есть это очередная такая вот имитация информации от Кремля, или все-таки действительно надо все-таки признать, что в 1996 году Борис Ельцин был избран, скажем так, с некоторым нарушением демократических правил при подсчете, и что в действительности тогда должен был победить Зюганов, судя по тому, что большинство населения России еще испытывало совсем, если мы убедились в том, что он через 20 лет испытывает еще ностальгию по Советскому Союзу, то, конечно, на 5 лет спустя тоже испытывала. То есть вот вопрос, конечно, такой риторический, потому что история не имеет сослагательных наклонений. И в Польше, например, пришел бывший коммунист к власти, и, в общем, Польша не изменилась как государство, скажем так. То есть, на ваш взгляд, если бы пришел Зюганов в 96-м году, дядя Зю, как всех пугали тогда.
Дедушка Зю.
Да, вот, то есть, может быть, было бы лучше, чем сейчас при Путине, то есть, вопрос такой, как...
Спасибо за вопрос.
И, и как бы в дополнение, действительно, Борис пришел как раз после выборов, и он не хотел идти, подозревая, что что-то там не так было. Но все-таки он пришел, и действительно, я лично его наблюдал 2 раза в Москве. Один раз он просто перебегал улицу в положенном месте, и было очень много машин, ехало, он между ними как олень пробегал. И, в общем, действительно было понятно, что то есть он видит цель и к ней стремится. То есть, и, возможно, это человек, который жил слишком рано в России. Вот такой вопрос еще.
Спасибо большое. Я на 2, наверное, отвечу, если можно.
I know your English is perfect, Alex, so maybe we can continue. We can continue in English.
Нормально, да? Или как лучше? Спасибо за вопрос. Thank you for both very important questions. So I guess I'll translate the questions to this. So the first one was, you said that there were some episodes that you also didn't know about, such as when Boris was offered Gazprom, and then you talked about the 96 presidential election, which was the election when Yeltsin won a second term in office. And there was a lot of talk that this election was actually rigged, that this was the first rigged election in Russia, and that would it have been better if Zyuganov had won, the communist candidate, because after all, in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, former communists did win. Your last point was that if Boris lived too early in Russia. So I'll go through them in order. So I actually also learned some of the new things. That this episode that he was offered the chairmanship of Gazprom, I never knew that. He never talked about this. I mean, he was the kind of person, he didn't really like to brag. When somebody would say something like really complimentary of him in his presence, he would always try to turn it into a joke and just put the tone down. He really hated it when people, I learned a lot of new things about him after he was no longer here, because he never spoke of this. So this I also didn't know about Gazprom. I also remember when we went to film, also a year ago, last September in Nizhny Novgorod, and we went to film this Khrushchevka, this apartment, where his relatives still lived. where he lived as a student. And I remember we were walking down with the cameraman, walking down the stairs after we'd finished filming. And you saw the apartment. They have like the gas thing, the old Soviet apartment. And my cameraman turned to me and said, "So you're saying that this is the family of the former first deputy prime minister of Russia?" I said, "Yeah." And he told me I didn't think that's possible. Well, I said, well, it generally isn't. He was the only one who was like this. But yes, this is the family of the former first deputy prime minister of Russia. So he always laughed that he would say that they're still looking for my candle factory, Свечной заводик. It's like from the 12 chairs from Ilf Petrov. Or was it from, yes, Свечной заводик в Самаре. So he, by that he meant that they're still looking for something that he'd done wrong. As governor, as deputy prime minister, something they could get him for. And they found nothing. He would laugh about this all the time. But yeah, that's how he was. On 96, I don't actually agree with the conventional wisdom. That is, by now, the conventional wisdom, yes, that this election was not entirely democratic. And a lot of people are saying now, задним умом, I don't actually know how to say that in English, but looking back, that maybe it would have been better if Zyuganov had won in 96. I do not agree with that. I agree, I mean, it's not the matter of agreeing, it's a fact that in many countries of Central and Eastern Europe, former communists did come back to power, including Estonia. You had Arnold Reuter, the former chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, who became president. You had Kwasniewski, you had other people, and you had, what was his name, Brazauskas in Lithuania. So you did have that generation of post-communists who came back, and nothing catastrophic happened. Zyuganov was not Kwasniewski. He was an unreconstructed Stalinist. He told people 3 days before the election, meaning the businessman and the business community said, you won't be able to reach Sheremetyevo on time before I get you. This is what he said openly. So no, I don't think to have an unreconstructed, nostalgizing Stalinist as president of Russia would have been a good thing. It wouldn't have been too good for you either, by the way, but for us certainly. And I actually do think, I remember this. I mean, I was 15 in '96. That's a really conscious age. I remember the election very well. I couldn't vote, but I could understand everything that was going on. And I actually, personally, I have no doubt that Boris Yeltsin did win a majority of votes in 1996, because you said correctly that this was just 5 years after the collapse. But because it was only 5 years after the collapse, a lot of people still actually remembered what it was like. Because now it's been 26 years, a lot of people have, especially the people who never lived through this, they have this romanticized image of, the great Soviet power. People in '96 still remember the bread queues, the rations, the coupons that you needed, to get the numbers you would write on your hand, number 137, that's your number in the bread queue. So you'd reach it in like 6 hours' time. People still remember that. And so they didn't vote for Boris Yeltsin, they voted against the Communist Party. That's how they won. Yes, certainly there was, the vast majority of the major media were supporting Yeltsin, that is a fact. But they were not compelled to. I mean, my father was at that time an anchor at NTV, which was not a state, it was an independent TV channel. And he was sincere for them. And actually, I found that after the 2002 presidential election in France, when it was Chirac against Le Pen, the senior, I found that a lot of people, when I spoke to French people at least, they actually understood this much better, because all the French media were also supporting Chirac and not the fascist guy, and that's normal. I mean, why would an independent journalist support somebody who wants to kill them or jail them? That wouldn't make much sense to me. So yes, the vast majority of the media supported Yeltsin. That is true. It's also true that 1996 was so far the only election in Russian history that went into 2 ballots. It was the only election in Russian history when the incumbent president and the opposition challenger were divided by 3% in the first round. It was like this. We've never had this before or after. So 96 was the last genuine presidential election we have, I would say. Oh, and by the way, when I say, I think it's important to note too, when I say that most media were biased in favor of Yeltsin, but they still covered Zyuganov. Zyuganov was on primetime TV in live talk shows. That's unthinkable today. So today, if you watch the Russian TV channels, either you would not know who, for example, Navalny is, or you would know that he's an American agent and a spy and an enemy of Russia. It wasn't like that back then. Zyuganov was allowed his say too, even though the journalist sympathies were clear. That is true. And in terms of the actual vote rigging, it is true that there were some cases that have been, in fact, proven. In some regions where there were vote rigging in favor of Yeltsin. One was in Dagestan, the other was in Tatarstan. But there were other regions where there was proven vote rigging in favor of Zyuganov, because don't forget, at that time we had freely elected regional governors. And many of the regional governors were communists. So they were rigging the votes in favor of Zyuganov and against Yeltsin. So on the balance, personally, I have no doubt that Yeltsin did win the '96 election. And again, it wasn't him who won. It was the communists who lost. And your last point, no, I don't think Boris lived too early. He lived in his time. He lived in the right time. He did so many things. He could have done so many more things. I completely agree with Vladimir Bukovsky. And when I say, when we wrote in the announcement that the man who could have been president of Russia, I don't just mean that time when he almost became president in 2000 but didn't. I also meant the future, because I agree with Bukovsky. I have no doubt that one day this man would have been the leader of Russia, even though he didn't much want to. That was true, by the way. But I think he would have, because we don't have many people who have a good reputation, that's important, who are great communicators and who can talk to people, and also who have successful government experience. In fact, I just said those three factors. I can't name another person like this. So no, he didn't live too early, but he should have lived, of course, for much, much, much longer.
Thank you, Vladimir, so much. And
Thank you, Mo.
I think that I can say it on behalf of all of us here and all of those people who will watch this film in the future, and especially when we will have a free access to the film.
Yes.
So I promise you that we will spread it very widely.
Initially, we'll publish it just the Russian version, because we're still continuing some screenings in Western countries until the end of the year. And probably at the end of the year, we'll publish this version with English subtitles. So then it will be open for both audiences.
So thank you so much, and thank you for your dedication and your work and your struggle. And we do what we can to help you, because we remember how we were helped by others 27 years ago. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everything.
Keep up, and there will be better Russia.
There will be.
Россия будет нормальной.
Россия будет свободной.
И нормальной.
Thanks a lot.